And so is there racism today? Yes, there is.
Mm-hmm.
Of course there is. I have a theory on how to deal with it at this point, which is different
Do tell.
from 1960, which is different from 1870, but today, because there's different stages in a nation's life, I think require different responses.
So how would you deal with it? Because obviously
I
the
think
city
right now,
it's not a racist country.
So I think right now, I'm not saying this is the answer 60 years ago, but right now, today, I think the right answer is actually...
Stay tuned to hear what Vivek Ramaswamy thinks is the solution to racism in the year 2024. I think if nothing else, you would enjoy the way he describes it. In this podcast, he joined the host of The Breakfast Club, Charlemagne the God, and DJ Envy to talk about a host of different issues, one of which was race. So I highlighted the most interesting parts of their conversation so we can analyze.
I think the Republican Party should become the party of 1776. The party that says, we stand for the ideals of the American Revolution. Self-governance, free speech, open debate, that you get to speak your minds openly as long as I get to in return.
As soon as Vivek Ramaswamy made this statement, I knew this conversation was about to take a racial turn. Let's watch.
You know, we weren't included in none of that, though. Black people, brown people like yourself.
Yeah. Well,
gay people like Envy. We were never included.
I'm black,
but let's celebrate the progress we have made towards those ideals. Because here's the thing about the United States of America. We're a nation founded of, I don't mean this as a joke, we're not a nation of gods. We're a nation of men. The difference between man and God is that man is imperfect. Yet we're a nation still founded on ideals.
But only white
so that
men
means
founded those
always,
ideas. That's the problem.
That's in the past, man.
That's not in the past. You know, the other...
Of course, this is such a common retort whenever anyone says anything in praise of U.S. history. And the response is often, well, what about black people? What about brown people? We did not get to partake in whatever it is that you're praising. So can we really praise that? And I really like how Vivek responded to this, because he makes this distinction between ideals and what is actually happening. Without making this distinction, the broader picture is ignored or missed while there's a hyper focus on, well, being a victim. If I have a goal or an ideal, to use their words, and instead of heading towards that goal in a straightforward manner, I end up getting sidetracked, I end up putting it off and doing all kinds of crazy things along the way, that does not take away from the quality of that goal. It says nothing about the quality of that goal. All it says is the quality of the process. But if I'm anchored to those goals and keep reminding myself of this vision that I want to attain, I'm always going to be moving ever so gradually towards that ultimate goal. And this is something that has to be acknowledged. The fact that the process was imperfect does not take away from the quality of the goal, nor does it take away from the progress that has been made towards that goal. And to not acknowledge that, we risk getting rid of the very ideals that have been the cause of so much progress, not just in our lives, but in the lives of so many billions of people around the globe.
You know, the other day, I can't remember the site, what they said,
I think
they referred to as a 7-Eleven worker at the White House.
Oh, the Babylon Bee.
Yeah, like...
This is
and that's
satire.
a right-wing conservative.
This is satire.
But that's how they look at us. That's not satire. That's how they look at you, and that's how they look at us.
Can I just say,
you feel?
what do you think? It was a joke. I took it as a joke. It actually, if you read into the article, which I did, it was actually poking fun at a lot of the left-wing self-awareness here.
I want to read for you this article that's in question, and you tell me if you don't think it's funny. So it goes, following former President Donald Trump's landslide victory in Iowa primary and immediate concession by GOP candidate Vivek Ramaswamy, Trump offered an olive branch by promising the billionaire entrepreneur a cabinet position running the White House 7-Eleven convenience store. And then it quotes Donald Trump here. It says, and forgive my Donald Trump impression, it's horrible. It says, I've always said Vivek is a great man, one of the greatest men, to be honest. That's why I've graciously offered him this incredible opportunity, a once-in-a-lifetime chance to run our big, beautiful White House convenience store. It is tremendous, wonderful place. Under Biden, the White House doesn't even have a 7-Eleven. Not good. We're going to bring convenience back to the West Wing. End of quote. And then the article goes on to say, Trump went on to say that he'll work closely with Ramaswamy every day when he takes office, stopping by the official 7-Eleven store located in the halls of the West Wing several times a day for a Diet Coke and, quote, one of the delicious warmed up cheeseburgers under the hot light thingies. End quote. Then it quotes Ramaswamy here. Technically, I'm really overqualified for this, and I'm a little suspicious as to why Trump chose me for this position over some other candidates, but I'll take what I can get at this point. End quote. Is this racial satire really so insensitive as to call into question the very ideals of this country or the progress that we've made so far?
What do you think Martin Luther King would say? We just had MLK Day. We celebrated. That was the day of the Iowa caucus. What do you think he would say about where we are as a country today? He said, I hope my 4 children grow up in a country where they're judged not on the color of their skin, but on the content of their character. When he said that about 60 years ago, and he woke up to the country, let's say he just teletransported to the country we're in right now, do you think he would say that, oh my gosh, we have regressed? Or that, oh, I'm very upset about where we've landed? Or he sees a country where everybody's able to go to the ballot box and cast their vote. Anybody's able to start a business. Is everybody starting from the same place? No.
There's a lot of voter suppression that keeps black people.
I'm asking you a question, though. If you just snap of a finger from 1963 or 1964, whenever it was.
He would say there's progress. He would say there's progress,
but it's still a lot of
I think he would say
but people
this
are still being judged by the color.
I think it's still a lot of work to do.
And so is there racism today? Yes, there is. Of course there is. I have a theory on how to deal with it at this point, which is different from 1960, which is different from 1870, but today, because there's different stages in a nation's life, I think require different responses.
So how would you deal with it? Because obviously,
I think right now,
it's not a racist country.
So I think right now, I'm not saying this is the answer 60 years ago, but right now, today, I think the right answer is actually to let it atrophy to irrelevance. It's like the equivalence. I'm a biologist by background. That's my background. If a virus gets so low, right? If racism is the virus. If it gets so low in the bloodstream at a certain point, the natural host immune system can just take care of it and it atrophies to irrelevance. But sometimes the way people actually die, COVID is an example of this. The way people die of a virus isn't actually from the effect of the virus. It's from an overactive immune system that kills the very host organ in the name of fighting a virus long after it's gone. And I think that that's close to what we're happening in this country with the fight against racism, is we are creating new racism today that I believe would not exist if we at a certain point would say we're going to let it go and move on.
Such an interesting point Vivek made right there, and the analogy was spot on. Without letting go of the remnants of this virus we call racism, without even recognizing it as a remnant, what we end up doing is overreacting and creating even more problems than what we started with. I really like how Vivek artfully got them to first acknowledge that there has been some progress before finally going on to address the more granular details that they are hyper-focused on, which is that there's still racism. But guess what? Racism isn't going anywhere. It's an unfortunate part of the human condition, and it's not limited to just being against black people or brown people. It's existed since humans have existed because we always find something to hate about other groups of people. And in the modern world where most of us live, with our heightened sensitivity towards any racial issue, the solution is much less about somehow getting rid of racism or really tribalism, which is at the heart of it, and much more about finding ways to go around these inevitable problems that we have as a human race.
If we at a certain point would say we're going to let it go and move on.
Give us an example. Give us an example.
New racism? New anti-black racism. Huh? A new wave of anti-black racism that I think is beginning in this country because of people's feeling that they are being denied something on the basis of their skin color in the name of these DEI policies. I think that's actually existed.
OG anti-black racism just never.
I'm not talking about OG. I'm Gen 2 is what I'm talking about. Yeah, I'll give you an example. I've run a company, and I've both in my campaigns and my companies, and I don't say this like, oh, I hired black people or black women and put them in roles of positions. I don't care what skin color they are. But it so happens that in multiple of my companies, enterprises, businesses, even the campaign, people in significant positions of authority leadership happen to be black and black women included. All right, so what? They're the best people for the job is why I put them there. And one of my companies, I mean, it turns out was one of the highest paid, if not highest paid person at the company. Okay. You hear what the other people will say who weren't as good to get that job, which is to say, oh, she only got that job because she's a black woman, which is unfair to her. It's unfair to the company. It's unfair to the people who led the company to make meritocratic decisions. And yet they are able to say that and have that impression because we do live in a corporate America where pharmaceutical companies and other companies say that we need to have quota systems that 25% of our workforce in vice president ranks or above need to be people of a certain skin color. Imagine if we didn't say that, but we just did it by merit. We would probably get to the same place or something darn close to it anyway.
People wouldn't do it for merit.
Without that second wave of race. I'm telling you, out of my self-interest is why I did it, right? But I grew up in this country, came from nothing, built multi-billion-dollar businesses in part by hiring the best person for the job.
Yes, but
so it was self-interest that guided me to do it.
Yeah, but the reason they have to have those 25% quotas is because of systemic and structural racism.
You know what's very interesting about the way Vivek responded to what he considers as new racism is that he didn't point at the fact that a lot of what is going on today is racism against white people. Rather, he turned that around, or rather, he went a step further and said, because of this racism, he didn't call it that, but essentially that's what it is. Because of this racism against white people, that somehow has become something to be proud about. Because of that, there are certain white people who would experience that and then turn around and be racist towards black people, whereas they might otherwise have never been racist to begin with. Personally, I think the more direct issue here is the racism against white people for simply being descendants of slave owners, presumably, because for any given white person, we have no idea where their lineage came from. We just assume that because they're white, their ancestors must have been slaveholders, and ergo, they are guilty by birth, which is completely nonsensical. But I do like how he took it a step further, because by pointing out what the consequence is for such white racism, he is better able to make a point that resonates with the people that he's talking to, whose mindset is all about how blacks are the ones who are suffering from racial prejudice. So he's focusing on that point that if you don't want racial prejudice, if you want to move on to a world that is free from that, you don't do so by attaching yourself to a narrative about how you are a victim of racism into perpetuity. Is there any point at which we can finally acknowledge progress and admit that racism is nowhere near what it used to be?
Let me tell you, one of the most best interactions I had in Iowa was with a black pastor. Not that many of them in Iowa, I promise you. He came to one of our events. He's a pastor, right? And so I was trying to think about how to speak the language that we both share in common. The virtue of mercy, forgiveness. So this is not to say that we're going to deny something's happened in the country, because I think that is an approach some people try to take, denialism, right? Oh, that didn't happen. No, I'm not taking that approach.
That's what Nikki Haley did last week.
Or 2 weeks ago, whatever it was.
That's what Tim Scott has done. That's what the vice president has done. Joe Biden has done. They all say, oh, America is not a racist country.
Yeah, or the history, right? But at a certain point, I think here's the approach to national unity is, I believe, and I think it's the truth. At a certain point, the right answer is clemency, is mercy. There's a time for mercy and there's a time for justice. And sometimes those are in tension with each other. But I think that now is a time for mercy. I think we have reached not the ultimate promised land. What did MLK say? I may not get there with you, but we will get there one day. And I think that at a certain point when you get there, it's when you're closest to the promised land that there's a temptation to actually focus on where you were at the start. But I think that we have to resist that temptation and say that, you know what? At a certain point in time, it's like when that virus is almost cleared. It's still a little bit of it left, but it's almost cleared to say that we're going to let it atrophy to irrelevance. And I think that's the point we're at right now, or else I worry we're creating more race consciousness in a way that creates more division rather than less right now. Well, and that's one of my core issues with the so-called DEI agenda. So it's not to deny anything else, and it's a hard thing to say, well, I was wronged. Well, how can you just say clemency and forgiveness now? And I'm going to say some things that might make you upset, but then you could have a bunch of other people that make a claim on something that they were wrong with, or Japanese people who were in internment camps, or Jewish Americans, or anybody else. We can all play that game. And
but the reason you need DEI
is
because of systemic and structural racism. Can you admit or just agree that this country, there is systemic and structural racism in this country?
I have to know what those terms mean, Charlemagne, to be able to answer.
You know systemic racism? You just used it. You used it a little while ago.
I said racism.
You said systemic and structural racism. You said structural racism.
In stating the argument for the other side, what's used. I don't think systemic racism, it's a little bit of a cop-out, right? I know what racism is.
We know there's inequalities in the healthcare system. We know there's inequalities in the justice system. We know these things already.
So has there historically been in this country? Yes, there has.
Yes.
Right? And I think that what we want to do is
eliminate...
eliminate...
a civil rights movement.
Right. And actually, a lot of what I'm standing for example, is I think that there are civil rights inequalities right now when it comes to your political beliefs.
So you celebrate the founding fathers?
When in fact, yes, of course I celebrate the founding fathers.
But the founding fathers were rapists and murderers.
I mean, Charlemagne, so I think we're going to have a deep disagreement on this one. These are people who set, without the ideals that they set into motion, we wouldn't be where we are today. Tell me about John Adams. How familiar are you with his story?
I'm not.
He was an abolitionist in his own time. He was the second president of the United States. He did not own slaves on principle. Not only that, he actually fought for the liberation of slaves as the second president.
What about George Washington, Thomas Jefferson?
Well, I mean, look, a lot of these guys. I mean, Thomas Jefferson is one of my favorite presidents.
I can always find one person to make a point, but
no. But I'm making the point that the people today who are going to go decry our founding fathers for being slaveholders would have been back then the people who were slaveholders.
But you do
right?
realize
That's what I'm saying, because they're just following the pack of their time.
Instead of recognizing the complexity, the very many aspects that makes up the culture and the many aspects that make up any given person, we rather focus on very specific parts. We hone in on these negatives of the culture, and we also do the same with the people who were influenced by that culture, as though any of us are immune to the influences of our own culture.
Do you think a person of color could ever be the GOP nominee?
Yes, absolutely.
Because I read an article in The Nation that said, you and Nikki Haley can't escape GOP racism. And the article says you two are boxed in by the bigotry that you deny exists. What do you think of that?
So I'll tell you what probably the bigger obstacle was for me. It wasn't skin color. And I still don't think it's a irresolvable obstacle, but it was religion. I'm Hindu. And, I think the easy thing you're supposed to do as a politician is, even if you're not, claim to be Christian, check the box, maybe shorten your name a little bit, make it easier to pronounce. Would that in the short run help my electoral chances? A lot of people who are professionals at this certainly say it would. But as I told you, my whole approach to politics is, I'm going to tell you who I am and what I stand for. And I'm a religious person.
So you think religion is the reason the GOP?
No, not at all. Not at all. But I'm saying that if I had to pick even between the two factors, it's not even race. One, I'm not making this up because I got a lot of earnest people in Iowa who told me they loved everything I say. And I don't begrudge them for this, but it was difficult to vote for me because I'm not Christian. And I respect that honesty. And the kinds of conversations we had about faith in Iowa, I mean, these were, including with the pastor, the gentleman who, put me through the push-up ringer before asking me a question about systemic racism, was actually one of the people who came down the side of, I know the difference between a pastor and a president. And I think he ended up becoming a supporter of mine, actually. He became a precinct captain, which is funny how that story ended. He came back a few weeks later to an event, even though he disagreed with me on thought he disagreed with me on some of the views initially that I had on eliminating affirmative action. Came back a few weeks later, ended up being one of our precinct captains in Iowa. And he's a Christian pastor, black, coming out with disagreeing with me on the politics at one point and a different religion on the other, and became a precinct captain. So it's not insurmountable. But I think that was a bigger question, and understandably, on people's minds, right? The nation is founded, as a matter of history, on Judeo-Christian principles.
This desire to pin everything on race is so interesting to me. You don't get a good job, it must be because of race. You don't get a raise at your job, it must be because of race. You don't get good grades at school, it must be because of race. You don't become the GOP nominee, it must be because of race. Could there possibly be anything that happens that doesn't have to do with race?
So you brought up Thomas Jefferson, and a lot of the left likes to cancel part of his legacy because he was a slaveholder. There's actually something coming from the other side that I saw as well, and I had a chance to educate people on and even refresh myself on.
What?
Thomas Jefferson was not a Christian, not a traditional Christian. He was a deist, actually. He made a part of the New Testament. He didn't like all the stuff about the miracles and everything else, but he liked the philosophy and the teachings of Jesus Christ. And so he took a razor blade and he cut out the parts of the New Testament that had the philosophy that he thought spoke to him. He used glue to glue them together. That constitutes the Jefferson Bible today. And so the interesting thing about that is I would meet a lot of people on the campaign trail who would be, frankly, disgusted. And I have to admit, part of me is also disgusted with the view that we can't respect Thomas Jefferson's legacy, the guy who at the age of 33 wrote the Declaration of Independence. I'm sitting in a swivel chair right now. This was invented by Thomas Jefferson, the man who was 33 when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. He invented the swivel chair right around the same time. That man, the unafraid, the guy on the Lewis and Clark expeditions, that we can't celebrate him today because he was a slaveholder. From that angle, to also tell a group of people who believes that only a Christian can be the U.S. president, who love Thomas Jefferson, who love the signer of the Declaration of Independence, who hate the left for saying that we can't celebrate Thomas Jefferson because he was a slaveholder, who actually believe that only a Christian can be president, and yet Thomas Jefferson wasn't a traditional Christian.
Are you saying it's
at the time he became the
it's
president?
okay that he was a slaveholder because he created the swivel chair?
No, I'm not. I'm saying that we are imperfect human beings.
This question sounds so annoying, and the double standard implied is also very ironical. It's like, let me paint for you this comprehensive picture of a man, a human being, with all the perfections and imperfections that is embodied within any human being, let alone a person who lived in this era where slavery was so persistent, and have you ask me whether I am justifying the imperfections with the perfections. It's like, no, but that's exactly what you're doing. You are ignoring all the perfections, all the achievements, everything that makes a human being complicated. You are ignoring all of that just so you can myopically focus on this one tiny variable of race, just because it's more convenient to your narrative.
Are you saying it's
At the time
okay,
he became the
it's
president.
okay that he was a slaveholder because he created the swivel chair?
No, I'm not. I'm saying that we are imperfect human beings.
Yes, that's
And
true.
that, you know what, 250 years from now, somebody will look at something that each of the three of us have done and criticize that 250 years from now and say, can you believe these
200?
people?
Shit, they doing it nothing.
No, but they're really good. They're doing it now. And they were doing it for him then too. But if they're doing it now, they're really going to do it 250 years from now. And right now, if we really thought about it and we took a few hours or a few days to reflect on it, we could probably figure out what that is. But if you asked you on the spot right now, no, I don't think you could tell me on the spot right now what people 250 years from now are going to come here and tell you that you were an immoral man for and all the other truths that you spoke, that we should reject them because you did some small thing that the people 250 years from now disagree with.
Well, being a slave owner is a small thing. But I know you got to go through.
But back then it was, actually. And that's the thing, in 1776.
It was the nature. It was the nature of the beast.
And so right now, don't be the person who was the slaveholder back then. Be John Adams. That's what we should call ourselves to be. The person who bucks the trend of their time to say, I'm going to speak on my own conviction and do what's different than being the product of my own time. Because anybody can parrot what the slogan is of their day. But the hard thing to do is to say the pack is running this way and I'm going this way instead anyway because it's grounded on my conviction. That's what we need.
People like John Adams are the reason you can point at it and say it was wrong, though, because John Adams knew it was wrong.
The more generations go by, the more inevitably our sensitivities change on any given issue. To hold people from the past to the fire of our modern day judgment without doing the same for ourselves when looking forward into the future is simply hypocritical. I think the point Charlemagne is trying to make here is that racism seems like such a horrible thing that regardless of what generation it was, it must have still been a horrible thing. And for these people to do that, it can be explained in no other way other than these were very horrible people. But again, he's missing the fact that people are a product of their environment. And just like we follow all of these norms without really realizing it, that's almost what it means to be a part of the society, is to have so many norms that we're barely aware of until we really start to consider other periods of times or maybe other cultures before we can really start to contend with what it means to actually be a product of our environment.
It was wrong, though, because John Adams knew it was wrong.
Well, a lot of people are going to be doing things today that are different than the way that each of us is going to be living our lives and say the same thing in 250 years from now. Somebody else is
People
going
like
to have the
Abe
same
Lincoln thought it
conversation.
was wrong, clearly.
Abe Lincoln wasn't around then, man. That was still
later on.
That was still later on. And we'll just take the story down. We'll just pass this lineage down. We don't talk American history enough. Actually, it irritates me. A lot of conservatives talk about the importance of knowing history without actually just talking about history. Let's talk this through. So John Adams, you know who his son is? John Quincy Adams. He's the first non-founding father who became a president. Here's a funny fact about him. He was the first, so outside of the founding fathers, he was the first one who was elected president. He actually wasn't a great president. He was elected out after one term. People didn't love him. So he tried to find everything else he could do. He went and tried to write some books, and he went and tried to start some nonprofits, and none of that spoke to him. He's the only president, John Adams' son, who went back to Congress after being a president. So he's elected to multiple terms of Congress. And you know what he went back to Congress with? Was one thing he regretted not doing as a president, was abolishing slavery. This is long before Abraham Lincoln comes along, okay? So he wanted to abolish slavery. His father was an abolitionist. He didn't accomplish much during his tenure as president. He was a good Secretary of State, but he was not a very good president. Think about the humility to say, I'm not even going to go to the Senate. I'm going to go become a congressman and get reelected multiple times with the mission of abolishing slavery. Now, here's what happens. There was a rule that Congress passes. It's called the gag rule, which stopped people from using the word slavery. Like they literally couldn't use the word slavery because they didn't want people to utter the word because it made them uncomfortable. So this guy's already been the U.S. president. Okay, so he has nothing to lose. So he's just a congressman now. He says, I'm going to say the word. I'm going to say it, slavery. Slavery, slavery, slavery. There, Congress has set the rule that you can't say the word slavery. Well, I'm going to say it. So they censure him and have, just like they have today for George Santos or whatever, they'll have the equivalent of kicking him out of Congress. Mm-hmm. So they have his trial in Congress. And he uses his own personal trial, because this guy's got nothing to lose. They use his own personal trial for saying the word slavery when you're not allowed to say the word slavery to make the case for abolition from the stand of his own trial. to being kicked out of Congress. At the end of that, they get rid of the gag rule. So you're allowed to say slavery, which opens up the debates that you're then allowed to have. So a year later, about a year or so later, he's given a speech on the Congress floor. I mean, it's amazing. This guy with this humility. He's given a speech on the Congress floor. He has a stroke in the middle of his speech. He dies right there. He doesn't die quite yet. They take him up to the upstairs room, keep him alive for another couple of days. And eventually he dies up in that anteroom outside in the same Congress where he then devoted that later stage of his career. And they took volunteers for who's going to be the person who carries out his funeral rites and carries him out. And the guy who raises his hand and does it was a first-term congressman nobody had heard of, hadn't said a word, by the name of Abraham Lincoln. And so these are the stories of our history, man. We don't tell these stories anymore. We celebrate, we put back our founding fathers and we talk about how these people are slave owners and we're going to dismiss the ideals they set into motion without recognizing that, like us today, these are imperfect human beings that still strived and to be the best that they possibly could have, just as we do today. And so it bothers me deeply for us to just lazily reject that as opposed to saying, we acknowledge those imperfections, but we're founded on the pursuit of a more perfect union.
Absolutely, but the reason
pursuit of liberty, equality, and justice for all.
You can't just dismiss it and say, okay,
I'm not dismissing it. Do I sound like I'm dismissing it, Charlamagne?
Yes, but the reason
I disagree with you, man. And I
the
think
reason
that
you can't say
if you're
Thomas
putting me in the
Jefferson
category of the conversation we had and saying that I just dismissed it out of hand, I think that's unfair. I just think that's unfair. I don't think I dismiss it, but I acknowledge the totality of what a human being is, which is an imperfect and flawed human being who we can still celebrate.
I'm fine with that, but you can't.
That's what we have to be.
But you can't tell people just to ignore the fact that Thomas Jefferson.
I'm not telling people to ignore it though, and this is what I think I'm in this to unite the country.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if we're going to take this seriously, every one of us has to acknowledge the full nuances of our history in every direction. To say that we're not going to listen to Thomas Jefferson or that our founding was illegitimate because they were deeply imperfect and flawed is every bit as bad as somebody who's going to say that I'm going to entirely dismiss the fact that they were slave owners. I think that both of those are mistakes that could lead to the failure of our country as we know it. I think our country will cease to exist if either side of our debate is on one hand willing to say, oh, slavery was some made-up myth and actually, I don't know, it was in the interest of, people could say such things, it was in the interest of black people to be slaves, whatever.
Ridiculous.
Okay. Well, I think that if we have a different side that says our founding fathers who wrote a Declaration of Independence founded on the pursuit of a more perfect union, right? The pursuit of liberty, equality, and justice for all, not claiming we're perfect, but that we're a nation founded on freedom for all who aspire to have it, and that we're imperfect. But we eventually got there 250 years into as darn close as we've ever been. To reject that and say that we can't celebrate that founding because they made a mistake of being slave owners. I think that is every bit as bad for the future of our country versus acknowledging that we are still pursuing that more perfect union.
What I would say is what you talked about with Thomas Jefferson when he took the razor and he took out some of the philosophies that he agreed with. We should take some of those things that we agree with, but then everybody should come to the table because all was not at the table when those people wrote those documents.
We got that.
We have too much of a diverse country now.
We understand that.
Okay.
But my point is not rejecting that or taking a hammer to it. It's more of a different response. It's like, we got it. Like at a certain point, we've got to say, we've got it.
We don't though.
No, but
we can, but we don't.
We got it, and now it's time for 360-degree mercy, clemency, forgiveness across the board, and that we're moving forward as one nation under God. And I think that moment is now, actually.
This overarching theme that Vivek has continued to try to make points for, which is the fact that for the first time in not just U.S. history, but in world history, we have come to finally recognize slavery for the obscenity that it actually is. When for most of our history, most of our recorded history as humans, slavery was the norm. And for us to be able to move past that, we have to let go of whatever attachment to grievances that we find ourselves having, because these grievances go as far back into human history as we can imagine. The Japanese have suffered it, the Jews have suffered it, the Muslims have suffered it, the Christians have suffered it. As I think Plato or Socrates, I can't remember which one, said, every line of slaves was descended from a line of kings, and every line of kings were descended from a line of slaves, or something to that effect. But the point is that to be able to move past that, we have to be able to exercise some mercy. We have to be willing to look forward to what is to come, instead of completely latching ourselves to what happened in the past and dismissing the fact that while modern problem might have historical roots, the perpetuation of that problem has less to do with history and more to do with what is currently being done to address these issues.